Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. This is a doubly exciting day for me. I feel like it's old home week that we're getting to do this again for the first time in really a couple of years, because we had to stop our Thursday afternoon programs even before the pandemic because of budget cuts and then the pandemic. But now we're back on track. Obviously, we're sticking to Thursdays. We have a new time, so we're doing 4:30 most of the time. That'll be our general time, but obviously you've figured that out or you won't be here. It's the people who show up at 6:30 that are going to be disappointed. So anyway, I'm really happy to have all of you here, and it's also exciting for me because we have Ellen Baumler back. And yeah, we weren't sure with the new time at 4:30 if anybody would show up and everything else going on. We thought, well, if people will show up for anybody, it's Ellen. So we're going to put her first and get everybody back on track. We do have a really exciting September lined up. There's some of these, I'll just set them over there, and there's some out in the lobby. Next week, we're going to be here with Jerry Ensler at 4:30 talking about his new book on Jim Bridger. So that should be really good. And then, of course, we have the Montana History Conference, a blast from the past, coming up in Butte, September the 23rd through the 25th. And of course, if you know anything at all about Butte, they're always ready to throw a good party. So we hope if you can, you'll join us. I know some of you have some speakers in the audience and some people who are registered, and it's going to be a really good time. And also, we're going to learn a lot. So that's important too. Is there anybody here who doesn't know Ellen? No? Okay. Well, you're in for a treat. Ellen, I had the pleasure of working with Ellen for many, many years, and I can't remember now, you worked for 26 years. Okay, and one of my goals when I started working with Ellen was to figure out how she does everything she does. And even after years of working with her, I still don't have a clue. I think that's one of the great mysteries. She's one of the most prolific people and accomplished people that I know. She knows so much about Montana history. She's definitely the go-to person for Helena history. This is, of course, obviously what we're here to talk about tonight, and this is her 13th book. So if you're superstitious, you might want to stay away from it. Number 13 in death, I don't know. I'm going to leave that up to you. But anyway, it's my great pleasure to have Ellen back here with us tonight. Thank you, Ellen.
I can't tell you how fun it is to see all these familiar faces, and whenever I come back to the Historical Society, I really feel like I'm coming home. But today especially, this is, I think, my second in-person presentation since like COVID started, which is a long time ago. And I'm so glad it's not a Zoom. I don't like to do the Zooms. So Montana does have 1,700 documented, at least 1,700 documented cemeteries. And that number doesn't include forgotten roadside burials, plots in abandoned places, and the remains of people who thrived on the landscape thousands and thousands of years ago. So my aim actually today is to explore with you the very earliest burial customs and consider a few individuals whose eternal rest was rudely interrupted, and to explore the evolution of Montana's treatment and places of the dead. So I'm sure that many of you have read about the Anzac Site, which was a discovery that was made in 1968 in Park County near Wilsall. And that discovery has had very far-reaching impacts, but my purpose here actually is to emphasize its cultural significance to Montana as the oldest known burial in our state. In the dim past, when mammoths roamed Montana's hostile landscape, someone lay this small child to eternal rest, dusted him with red ochre, and placed precious heirlooms, also covered in red ochre, over him. He was tucked into a rock shelter, and there he lay for more than 10,000 years undisturbed. Now, ochre is a red mineral that's found in rocky outcrops. Archaeologists have recorded early burials saturated in ochre in the Baltic, in Europe, in Britain, in Spain, Israel, New Zealand, and myriad other places as well. Methods and meanings, no doubt, have changed over thousands of years, but in diverse examples of very early burial rites and beliefs, the color red and the use of ochre is often a common thread. Ochre is the main pigment that is used in the earliest pictographs, like this one in France, and elsewhere, and here also in Montana. Most anthropologists today agree that modern humans probably entered the New World via the Bering Land Bridge at least 15,000 years ago, and maybe even longer ago than that. Cultural practices came with these early people. The child's gravesite is not only Montana's first known burial, but it is also the only Clovis period skeletal remains yet to be discovered in the entire New World. Clovis culture is the earliest known culture in the Western Hemisphere, and the exquisite tools of these early people were discovered first in 1932 in Clovis, New Mexico, hence the name. Their stone weapons have since been found across the United States, but not with human remains. Only the Anzac Site can actually make that claim. So fine Clovis spear points indicate a hunting prowess and the capability of bringing down very large prey. Clovis tools span a millennium and then they disappear from the archaeological record. Theories for their disappearance include climatic changes that may have affected their food source or hunting to extinction the animals that ensured their survival. While DNA taken from the Anzac child could not disclose the cause of death or health-related details, it added significantly to the history of early New World inhabitants. So the sample showed a 1 to 2 year old male descended from Asian and not European ancestors, supporting the migration theory that pre-Clovis people probably arrived from Asia, perhaps by the Beringian land bridge, and they may have followed the ice-free corridor through what is now the Rocky Mountain front, and that corridor runs directly through Montana. Fossilized bison antiquus from this corridor dates to 13,000 years before present, further supporting the theory that the corridor provided an avenue for the migration of animals as well as people. The Anzac child's DNA is the oldest recovered in North America and links his ancestry to descendant indigenous American populations. Some believe that the spectacular Anzac Site artifacts that are displayed around the corner here at the Montana Historical Society comprise a toolkit of utilitarian implements in various stages of manufacture. Some of these artifacts were new and never used, but some were much older and had seen use. In fact, one of them tested positive for camel blood. Camelops hesternus, extinct camels were among the animals known to roam here in Montana. The toolkit includes everything needed for survival and serves as a visual how-to manual showing the various tools in different stages of manufacture. Their covering in red ochre mixed with blood, in this case rabbit's blood, is indicative of ritual activity and a practice reaching back thousands and thousands of years. So supplying this child in death with everything needed for survival is evidence of belief in an afterlife. Thousands of years later, some of these customs remain even today. Montana's tribes, like others across the North American plains, most commonly interred their dead above ground. Red, as in the longest ago, continued to symbolize life's transition to death. Red blankets or cloth eventually was substituted for ochre, and even in the dim past, when caves and rock ledges may have been the graves of especially prominent individuals, open-air interments, which allowed the spirit to travel freely, were more common and are very, very ancient. Open-air interments persisted in Montana until the 20th century, when whites imposed earth burials because of health concerns. But even so, the custom continues discreetly even today. So these earliest burials reveal practices and beliefs that transcend generations. The desire to place the dead in strategic places carries over to our present desire to locate our cemeteries in beautiful settings, or to scatter ashes in places that were special to the deceased. From the dawn of time, objects sometimes accompanied the dead as memorials and to assure a smooth transition to the afterlife. Horses, as here in this Russell painting, oops, I can't really do it. There is a dead horse there. I hope that you can see that. Anyway, horses, as here in the Russell painting, and also dogs of the deceased were often killed to accompany the dead in the afterlife. So consider the thousands of bones from these open-air burials. I mean, just think about that, scattered to the winds across the big sky over thousands of years. The bones of others repose in mountains, across plains, in trees and valleys and hills, in and beneath our cities, in our towns, under our roads and shopping centers. It's kind of a strange thing to think about. It's hard to imagine how many people may have walked in our footsteps and left pieces of themselves literally here. And it's also poignant to realize that not all of those who were planted here in Montana, like the Anzac child, for example, have enjoyed uninterrupted rest. In 1937, Oscar T. Lewis, who was a Glendive rancher and self-taught archaeologist, discovered a circular grass-covered mound on a bluff overlooking the Yellowstone River in Dawson County. It proved to be a part of a rare 600-year-old earthen village, likely established by early Crow Indians when they split from the Hidatsa and moved west from modern-day North Dakota. The Hagen Site, which is named for the landowner at the time, is a National Historic Landmark, and it includes the mound, an earthen lodge, and 20 cache pits. The settlement may be the key to a crucial turning point of a people in transition from farmers to bison hunters. The mound, or raised platform, formed a perfectly engineered circle and contained large numbers of human bone fragments, mostly skulls, mandibles or jaws, and teeth. Dr. William Malloy, who oversaw the excavations, concluded that it was a ceremonial complex, including the remains of many individuals. Some mandibles appeared to be violently separated with stone implements. Historically, the Mandan, Hidatsa, and other Northern Plains tribes interred their dead above ground on raised scaffolds, like you see here in the background. While some groups left the dead to return to the elements, others gathered the bones for reburial. The Mandan retrieved the bones after the tissue disintegrated, and they separated and bundled the bones, burying the skeletal remains, and then they placed the skulls with the separated mandibles in a mortuary circle, like you see here. Malloy believed the platform at the Hagen Site seemed to correspond to this practice. But in Montana, the dead were not usually grouped together, but rather laid to rest singly in remote places and isolated areas. It was a common belief that open-air interment allowed the spirit to travel freely, and that belief persisted for thousands of years and continues even today. One source claims that scaffolding in trees was the most ancient and preferred method of interment among the Upper Missouri tribes. If the deceased was male, the face was painted red, the body was wrapped in a blanket, and if the person was prominent, a layer of scarlet cloth could complete the shroud. In ages past, painted skins served that same purpose. Weapons and personal items placed next to the bundle included everything needed in the afterlife. A tightly laced buffalo robe then encased this entire assemblage. Sometimes gathered skulls were also placed with the deceased, as you see here. And in a later time, the body might be enclosed in a wooden coffin, like this one here. If there were no trees, the burial might be on the ground and loosely covered with stones. Cairn burials might appear as rock piles, but they were placed there intentionally. Cairns should never be disturbed or removed. Sometimes prominent individuals were interred in their lodges. As Christianity spread, some then opted for burial in cemeteries, but open-air interments remained preferable. Near the confluence of the Yellowstone River and Alkali Creek, which once flowed at the base of the bluffs that you see here in the center of modern-day Billings, just above the Metra Park, several places recall thousands of years of occupation. Hundreds of river crow lodges once lay below the rim rocks along Alkali Creek. In 1876, Lieutenant James Bradley noted petroglyphs carved into the face of one of the bluffs, slightly west of the Metra Park. The Crow didn't know who did the carving, but they knew the name of the bluff, the place of the skulls. An epidemic, probably smallpox, swept through the camp, and survivors told the story about how bodies covered the area and horses and dogs ran wild with no humans to care for them. And so the few survivors later returned to collect the scattered skulls. They placed the skulls on a shelf that ran along the cliff face about 2/3 of the way up. The place of the skulls is today known as Skeleton Cliff, which is not the same as misnamed Sacrifice Cliff on the other side of the Yellowstone. That's a whole nother story. But there is faint surviving art on the cliff face below the place of the skulls, and it depicts a crying round face carved into the rock through a layer of red ochre. The image, a combination of petroglyph and pictograph, overlooks the Yellowstone River. The face is unique among rock art in Montana, but it's similar to at least one example in Washington State. Saguglalul, or She Who Watches, at Horse Thief Lake State Park near the Dalles, dates to about 1700 to 1840. It also combines pictograph and petroglyph art. It is near a burial. It's carved through a layer of red ochre, and it overlooks a river, the Columbia River. The circles around the eyes may represent the sunken eyes of sick people. The Montana image is likely mortuary art that the Crow or some other tribe adapted from their western travels. Whatever the origin, the crying image identifies the area as a place where tragic events happened, and the use of red ochre follows cultural practices from the most distant antiquity. In 1877, the town of Colson grew below the bluffs on the right. You can see them there on the right. Dr. William Alonzo Allen, who was a longtime Billings dentist and blacksmith, how's that for a combination? He was working in his Colson blacksmith shop and noticed these red streamers that were fluttering over a timbered outcrop across Alkali Creek, above the place of the skulls. So he investigated and discovered 100 tree interments. Red blanket shrouds had unraveled and were blowing in the wind, and possessions of the dead littered the ground. The crying face petroglyph and the stories support the theory that the cemetery resulted from some dire event necessitating multiple interments, which were highly, highly unusual at that time. Smallpox, for those of you that may not know this history, and such dire events disrupted cultural practices and resulted in multiple burials in one place. The worst smallpox epidemics occurred in Montana in 1780, the mid-1830s, and 1869-1870. Now, during the fur trade era, every post had its own cemetery. Time, weather, and shifting river courses and urban encroachment took tolls on many of Montana's earliest white cemeteries at forts and trading posts. Urban development, like you see here at Fort Benton, for example, prompted moving the original post cemetery and later the 1860s county cemetery in the early 1880s. Cemetery obliteration or preservation depends upon two major factors: continued relationships of the living with those interred and the need for progress. So Fort Khanna was a Hudson's Bay Company post founded near present-day Arley in Lake County in 1846. It operated under the Angus MacDonald family until 1871. Its surviving building that you see right here is the oldest standing structure in Montana. The fort's well-preserved small cemetery includes the graves of Angus MacDonald and other family members, as well as unknown graves. Half a mile from the fort, this little tiny cemetery, the plots have been maintained by local MacDonald descendants and also by the Fort Khanna Restoration Society. Before the widespread practice of embalming, being buried alive and awakening in a coffin was a very common fear. So bells, sometimes placed above the grave, attached to a string in the hand of the deceased, were very popular. Although no string here is attached, maybe at one time there was, I don't know, but it seems that the custom does persist. I haven't seen it anywhere else, and maybe if any of you have, let me know. So St. Ignatius is an important place in Montana's history. Catholic missions do dot Montana's landscape, and some of them have well-preserved cemeteries, although the graves are usually unmarked. But conversion to Christianity prompted cultural changes among Native people, including earth burials. St. Ignatius Mission and its cemetery were established in 1854. The mission was the final resting place for priests, nuns, and First Nation Catholic converts on the Flathead Reservation. The cemetery eventually became full, and many burials were moved. There are just a few scattered headstones in the 2 square blocks of the old cemetery today, where hundreds and maybe even thousands still lie beneath the sod. It remains a sacred place to the St. Ignatius community, and it is Montana's oldest existing Catholic cemetery. Maybe you're familiar with this. Once settlers began to add their dead to the soil, early graves were haphazard, and they were most often unmarked. There were no tombstone makers in Montana until the late 1870s, and even then the practice of using tombstones didn't really catch on. Wood was very scarce, and tombstones had to be mail-ordered and at the local mercantile. They were extremely expensive to send, as you can imagine how heavy they were. And besides that, not only were they heavy and very expensive, but often people were so transient that they didn't have time to wait for the tombstone to arrive. So as late as 1883, when Helena inventoried its existing cemeteries, and we have always had a lot of cemeteries. At that time, we had at least half a dozen of them. Only 1/4 of all the graves were marked. 1/4. One official stated at the time, and I quote, "Some of the noblest men and women lie buried, yet their resting places cannot be identified. After considerable inquiry, we do not find that a plot of the lots is kept. The county grave digger keeps no record of interments. He digs a hole, covers a corpse, and the name of the dead is buried in the same oblivion as his body. So documentation of deaths is problematic, really, in Montana until the 20th century. Newspapers didn't always publish obituaries or death notices or causes of death. Epidemics were very poorly covered in the press because of fear of panic. And death certificates in Montana were not required until 1908. So there are some physical reminders of those who died with their boots on, that is, in some violent manner, and others who died too soon in Montana's mining camps and boom towns. Mining camp cemeteries with many unmarked graves are easily lost as residents move on and buildings crumble, and time passes and landowners develop or cultivate the land or use it for some other purpose. Bannock, Nevada City, and Virginia City, however, are fortunate to retain their first burial grounds. Bannock's Boot Hill, do you see with the arrow there, north of the town, may be the state's earliest surviving community burial ground. The Bell Tombstone in that cemetery is one of Montana's oldest, and it has, I think, interesting symbolic significance. The crude hand-cut stone marks the grave of William H. Bell, who died in 1862 of mountain fever. According to the history of Montana's Fraternal Order of Freemasons, the Vigilante Warning 3777 has nothing to do with the dimensions of a grave, as many people believe. Rather, the 3 recalls the 3 Masons with the Fisk expedition who met on Mullen Pass in 1862 and opened and closed the first lodge meeting. The 7 refers to the 7 Masons who were among the signers of the Vigilante Oath, and the 77 refers to the funeral of William Bell here, because 76 Masons attended the funeral, and the 77th was the corpse himself. Difficult accessibility and the desire for a more formal burial ground is why the community of Bannock likely established a new cemetery around 1880. It doesn't look much like a new cemetery there, but that is it. Montana's sister cities of Nevada and Virginia bloomed when gold was discovered at Alder Gulch in 1863. Nevada City's original cemetery is still in minimal use by the ranching community, and it has dozens of early unmarked graves. Stones like these here may mark some of the graves. We don't really know for sure. Virginia City's original Boot Hill Cemetery is preserved thanks to the infamy of the 5 road agents that were hanged in 1864. The stigma of lying forever in the same cemetery as these accused road agents was repugnant to many, and so it prompted the opening of Hillside Cemetery across the ridge and the removal of some of the graves there. Not all those buried on Boot Hill, however, had loved ones to accomplish that task. William and Clara Dalton, for example, who died in 1863 of typhoid fever, were among those left to eternally repose on Boot Hill as their 4 children moved on. While some might believe that no remains are buried on Boot Hill, I know there is a master's thesis that makes that claim, eyewitness accounts prove otherwise. Years after the hangings in 1907, Lou Calloway described Boot Hill firsthand. He said that there were 2 lines of undisturbed burials at that time, one line on top of the hill and another slightly downslope to the west. 3 stones forming a triangle marked each anonymous grave. Adriel B. Davis, who had been an active vigilante and helped bury the 5 accused road agents, settled the controversy because Davis knew the order of the burials and pointed out the grave of George Lane. Exhumation of Lane's congenitally deformed foot confirmed his identity and thus the graves of the other 4. The foot was removed, and the 5 graves were marked with names for the very first time. The shellacked foot, with socks still attached, was on exhibit at the Thompson-Hickman Museum until distant relatives reclaimed it in 2016 under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. The foot was cremated, and the ashes were then spread over his grave. In the 1920s, the Daltons' grandchildren returned to Virginia City to place a commemorative monument on Boot Hill, but not on the actual grave site, which is not known. They, along with Martin Lyon, who was murdered in January of 1865, the 5 road agents, and others who had no family member to exhume them and rebury them, most certainly rest there as well. Unlike most places, Helena actually had a hanging tree that served for at least 10 hangings that we know of. Some of the known victims were reportedly buried in the city or Catholic cemeteries, but others were most likely buried near the place of execution. Evidence has twice surfaced in the neighborhood where the tree, which was cut down in 1875, once stood. One set of remains surfaced in 1900 when workmen were digging a foundation in the backyard of a house on Highland Street, and they uncovered a skeleton. A second set of remains surfaced in Davis Street in 1933 when workmen were installing gas lines. A pair of boots with fancy stitching found on this skeleton actually matched the boots in this rare photograph of the hanging of James Daniels in 1866. They're unlike the boots that people wore commonly back then. The town of Colson, which I mentioned before, was not a mining camp, but rather it was a river town on the north bank of the Yellowstone that thrived from about 1877 to the mid-1880s. The town was doomed when the Northern Pacific prompted the founding of Billings nearby. Colson's Boot Hill today sits in an unlovely urban setting above Billings's busy Main Street. It includes an unknown number of graves, and eventually the few markers disappeared, and the site was little more than a pasture. But it wasn't forgotten, and in 1921, an obelisk was placed there to mark the site. And in the 1970s, Boy Scouts added rows of crosses, like you see here, but not necessarily on actual graves, because the graves were mostly unmarked. Most early graves were unmarked, unless with rocks or crudely made wooden headboards or crosses. As communities became more permanent, several early marble works opened briefly in the later 1870s and early 1880s. But A.K. Prescott was actually the first to establish a long-term monument business. He opened a marble works here in Helena in 1884, and soon after that in Butte. By 1890, his company had produced some 3,000 tombstones throughout Montana. His company's signature is found on many tombstones in many, many communities. Next time you go to a historic cemetery, look for those signatures because they're really fun to find. With A.K. Prescott, one of his specialties was the child's chair, and there are signed examples of this in Bozeman, Helena, Butte, and Deer Lodge, and perhaps elsewhere too. Physicians in 19th century Montana considered an epidemic to be 5 cases of the same disease. Such ravages knew no social boundaries, and many Montana cemeteries reveal casualties, especially of children. The Silver Camp at Elkhorn has a particularly pathetic legacy. Its remote but well-preserved cemetery, perched high on a wooded hillside above the town, graphically tells the story of a diphtheria epidemic in 1889 that claimed almost all of Elkhorn's children. But just as tragic is another story that you don't always hear about, and that is the story of Harry Walton, who was 9, and Albin Nelson, who was 10, and somehow or other, these 2 boys escaped that epidemic. They found a quicksilver container full of black powder that the adults used to detonate for community celebrations, and apparently this one had been overlooked. The powder exploded and blew the boys to absolute bits. They couldn't even identify the separate remains, so they're buried in a common grave. But just imagine the September after this terrible epidemic, and these 2 boys had been safe, and that happened. Oops. So beginning in 1866, the Missoula community's first dead were buried at the base of Mount Jumbo. You can see the headboards there, in what is now the Lower Rattlesnake Historic District, between present-day Poplar and Cherry Streets. There are no burial records, but the cemetery was in use by the city until about 1884, when the city cemetery was opened. The city developed a residential neighborhood on top of the burial ground, as shown in this plat map of 1889. Cherry Street homeowners are aware that there are potential remains buried beneath their properties, and they are, let me tell you, very careful where they dig. And some homeowners actually have reported pieces of coffins in their basement walls. In 1974, one Cherry Street resident was adding a porch to his house when the backhoe turned up 2 sets of bones encased in the decayed wood of 2 coffins. The bones, along with pieces of metal hardware and splintered wood, were turned over to the University of Montana's anthropology department, where several generations of anthropology students have studied them. Over the years, the students have solved some of the mystery, determining that one individual was a child and the other a female adult. Coffin hardware fragments that you see here were consistent with 19th century casket styles, but whose eternal sleep was so rudely interrupted? Well, the style of the wooden coffin, narrow at the feet and wider at the shoulders, with silver handles, were consistent with the 1870s and the 1880s. Student analysis of the adult bones revealed a female between 25 and 34 years old with a poor diet and porosity of the bones, which is indicative of tuberculosis. The General Land Office, or GLO, records reveal that in 1871 and 1872, Cyrus McQuirk was the landowner of the cemetery. So on May 9th, 1872, Henrietta McQuirk Harrison, who was visiting her brother Cyrus, died of consumption, the common term for tuberculosis. Scientific analysis of the bones, including testing for tuberculosis, could further strengthen the hypothesis that the adult skeleton was that of Henrietta Harrison. And I think it's a really great example of how archaeology and his history really go hand in hand, and they don't always, practice isn't always that way. In Helena, St. Mary's Catholic Cemetery on Oaks was in use from the 1860s until the early 1900s. This is a very, very, very rare photograph of a historic cemetery. It's the only one I have ever seen. In the 1970s, the city acquired this property, which had long been abandoned, and created Robinson Park. A few families at the time relocated their loved ones, but at least 1,065 graves were undisturbed. Remains have surfaced outside the park when city crews replaced water and gas mains. In 2004, several caskets came to light, including one child's casket, this one with a viewing window. Likewise, in 2018, more excavating uncovered some 7 caskets bordering the park. Both times, workers scratched their heads at the grisly discoveries. But all they had to do was turn around and read my sign, recounting the history of the park. So it's a good idea to do a little research before you dig. Montana's early cemeteries include interesting ethnic burial grounds. Many Slavic graves at Bear Creek, for example, display Cyrillic lettering, and some contain portraits of the deceased. You can see those in other cemeteries as well. Helena's Jewish Home of Peace includes family plots gathered around a quaint series of brick walkways, almost like a village neighborhood. And many communities have Chinese sections. This one at Butte's Mount Moriah preserves a rare funerary burner, which is part of Chinese funerary rituals. And a row of Japanese headstones at Hillcrest Cemetery in Deer Lodge speaks to the Japanese workers who replaced the Chinese in the 1890s, building the Great Northern Railroad and refurbishing the lines into the 1900s. Following the traditions first noted in the Anzac burial, Native Americans and many other cultures too continue to leave familiar or treasured objects with the deceased to aid their journey to the afterlife. And there are unusual memorials too. For example, for Agnes Merrill, a prostitute, it's pineapples, a symbol of welcome to visitors, on the four corners of her wrought iron tombstone enclosure, or wrought iron grave enclosure. And this little puppy, longing for his master, perched on the edge of a tombstone at Main Cemetery in White Sulphur Springs. Montana's more elaborate cemeteries evolved from models that grew from trends in Europe and the eastern United States. In the late 1700s, a movement began in Paris where health concerns over urban burials and the exposure of human remains prompted the creation of Père Lachaise Cemetery in 1804. It was the first architecturally designed and formally planned garden park cemetery. Oops. By the 1830s, this idea had caught on in the United States as small cemeteries like this one in New York became grossly overcrowded. Where urban burial places were overfull like that, walls sometimes collapsed when flooding occurred, sometimes sending generations of burials one on top of the other out into the open. Floating coffins and exposed remains, known as bone gumbo in the South, brought well-founded fears of spreading diseases. Beginning in the United States in the 1830s, the rural cemetery movement promoted the image of peacefulness surrounded by nature, which was a contrast to previous negative views of cemeteries. Rural cemeteries with landscaped grounds and romanticized monuments served a dual purpose. They alleviated the crowded conditions of small, overfull urban burial grounds, and many believed spread diseases, but they also provided recreational space and a place to reflect and a place of history where young people could admire the deeds of their ancestors and model their own lives accordingly. At a time when 43% of all children died before the age of 5, death was a common family companion. Mothers took their children to the cemetery to allay their fears of death. In Montana, some park-like cemeteries, such as Sunset Hills in Bozeman, were originally informally planned and simply evolved into places of public enjoyment. By the later 19th century and early 20th centuries, Montana's larger cities began to cultivate formally planned cemeteries and artistic sculptured monuments. While cemeteries were usually located in rural settings, partly for aesthetic reasons, in Butte, health and sanitation made it imperative. Mining created ground disturbance, and early community burials didn't always stay underground, Mount Moriah was one of Montana's earliest formal burial grounds, platted in 1877. That's very early. It was less an aesthetic function, but more of a necessity since there was no landscape, just flat, barren soil. As much as the community really wanted a beautiful burial ground, smelting polluted the area and nothing would grow. So Butte citizens made up for the lack of landscaping with fanciful and lovely tombstones. Consequently, Butte has the most unique and attractive cemetery art of any Montana city. Although landscaping was at first far-fetched, by 1905, as smelting centralized in Anaconda, and trees and shrubs began to revegetate, and today Mount Moriah is beautifully landscaped. Missoula City Cemetery is an early example of the Eastern Park-like model. County surveyor and civil engineer Harry V. Wheeler formally platted the grounds in 1885 in block sections with roads to the outside, alleyways for horses and carriages, and large hitching areas in square and circular patterns. With experience gained in Missoula, Harry Wheeler then went on to design Helena's Forest Vale Cemetery in 1890. Although the 160 acres were bleak and treeless, Wheeler created a natural-looking setting with looping driveways, a small lake with a tiny island, and a grand entry gate. But among Montana's high-style cemeteries, the C.E. Conrad Memorial Cemetery in Kalispell is really the culmination. It incorporates the use of the natural environment with winding hilly pathways, following the natural contour of the landscape, and promotes the cemetery as a public park-like retreat. Professionally designed by Arthur Hobart in Minneapolis in 1903, it includes these great sweeps of lawn that have non-intrusive embedded tombstones that you can't even see. It is a memorial park concept that reflects the final phase of cemetery design. Alicia Conrad established the cemetery as a memorial to her husband and saw to the passing of Montana's very first cemetery legislation in 1905. Most importantly, that legislation allowed perpetual care. The Conrad family mausoleum is a focal point of the cemetery, but the ferry steps cut deep into the cliff below the mausoleum are a Kalispell legend. They once led to a carriage path which gave Mrs. Conrad private access to mourn her husband. So the evolution of Montana's cemeteries mirrors the state's development from pre-contact to frontier, to fledgling camps, and to settled communities. Boot hills and simple pioneer burial grounds gave way to formally planned cemeteries. Cemeteries became the last great necessity, where the dead could not only take their final rest, but where the living could take their leisure. But traditions remain even today, and cultural practices of long ago sometimes still dictate treatment of the dead. In conclusion, it's important to know that human remains should be reported to authorities and left alone. A burial in a remote place doesn't mean that it was intentionally abandoned. Rather, it was most likely placed there for a reason and deserves the same consideration as a grave in a formally planned cemetery. Many believe that exhumation is a disruption in the journey of the dead. So whether a person lived 1,000 years ago or yesterday, the dead deserve respect. My book, The Life of the Afterlife, traces the history of Montana's burial grounds, but it also showcases some institutional cemeteries, like that of the state prison at Deer Lodge, and the vast neglected cemetery at Warm Springs, and battlegrounds that became burial grounds. And it includes a discussion of some funerals, such as that of Plentycoo, and special memorials to those lost in disasters like the Man Gulch fire, and a few memorials to animals like Butte's Auditor, Fort Benton's Shep, and my favorite, Old Pitt, an elephant buried in the parking lot of the Beaverhead County Fairgrounds at Dillon. While I make no claim that Life of the Afterlife is a comprehensive work, and many worthy Montana cemeteries are not included, and I feel really bad about that. My hope is, though, that the book will maybe spark interest in local cemeteries and foster not only a better appreciation of these places, but also encourage their unknown stories to come to light. And there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of stories that are yet to be discovered. So lest we forget those first Montanans who came to this land and whose dust lies scattered across our mountains, hills, and plains. A small group gathered on a rainy Saturday morning in 2014. They formed a circle around a sealed box holding the scant remains of the Anzac child. He gave the scientific community incredibly valuable information, but it was time for closure. Tribal elders and scientists came together for his reburial, which was a compromise between the quest for further knowledge and native tradition. The Anzac child's potential to teach future scientists ended, but with this closure, all present hoped that his spirit could at last find peace. Thank you. So if anyone has questions or comments, I would be glad to try to answer, but I don't know everything. Questions? Come on, guys. Yes.
So it's not disrespectful
Mm-hmm.
to walk on top of the grave or recreate on top of the grave in like these park scenarios?
Not really. No, the question was, or the statement was, it's not really disrespectful to walk across graves or recreate in cemeteries. I would say it is disrespectful to walk over what you know is the burial place. But yes, these places, these beautiful places were intended for you to recreate there and to enjoy the art and to learn about ancestors or others. Yeah.
But stick to the path.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Anybody else? Yes.
So which one, in all of the Montana communities, is your favorite?
What is my favorite cemetery?
Yeah.
I think modern cemetery or currently used cemetery, probably it's the Conrad Cemetery in Kalispell, because I know that history, and the ferry steps are so cool. They're called the ferry steps because if you ascend them and then descend them and count the steps, you will never get the same number. And I've done it myself, and it nearly killed me because there are like more than 80 steps or something like that. And I got different. And I think it's partly because you're so darn tired you don't remember what you counted the last time. But yeah, I really love that cemetery. It's very beautiful. Yes?
How many years did you do research on it?
How many years did I do research on this book? A lot of this research goes back to the very beginning of my time in Montana, which is 1988. And it's just sort of I never thought about doing a book on cemeteries, but a lot of this information is stuff that I did as I worked at the Historical Society. I did 1,600 signs or something like that all across Montana, and I've come across a lot of trivia, and I just, a lot of it is information that I didn't necessarily consciously collect for this book, but a lot of it sort of came together for the book. So I consciously started putting the book together. It probably took me about 3 or 4 years. Yeah. Yes?
This is a big question. Where is
Oh, the Hagen Site?
No, this is in Butte, and I have been there once, and I cannot find the cemetery. It's the monument to the mine disaster.
I believe that the question was, where is the monument to the Granite Mountain Mine in the Butte Cemetery? Yeah, there is a monument, not the one that's out, not the speculator one that's in town, but the one in the cemetery. I'm almost going to say it's on the boundary of the Catholic cemetery and the Mount Moriah, I believe. I think it's not real distinctive. I'm not surprised that you haven't been able to find it. I would look at Zenabeth McGlashan's book on Butte cemeteries, and I bet you can find the location there. Yeah. Anybody else? Well, thank you all for coming. Appreciate it.
She'll be in here and she'll be happy to sign them. I'm also sure answer individual questions if you have.